Thank you so much, Sophie. Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Just gonna move some things around here so I can see what I need to see. I can't tell you how excited I am to be part of this. When I heard from Sophie that this was happening, I was blown away, and I'm just so happy to be part of it and to have something that I hope is helpful here to contribute. I'll get started right away because the time is tight and you have many people to hear from today. But I'll just start by saying that I'm coming to you from Canada, in the part of our land that is the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I am going to, in my presentation, I'm going to try to summarize the rationale for prohibiting corporal punishment. And Linda makes an excellent point. We're in the same situation in Canada. We still have the defense, and we're trying to get it repealed. We are not at the stage of prohibition either. Some countries just do it all at once. Some countries do it in stages. And I fully understand your concerns, Linda, about using the proper language. We also in Canada are not talking about a ban. We're nowhere close to that. We're just trying to repeal the defense. But I'm going to talk about prohibition, or maybe I should use the word law reform, and what it's based on, what the rationale for it is. And I'm going to try to fit in a little bit about Canada at the end. But I thought that maybe I would kind of set the stage with bringing us a common understanding of why law reform happens. There we go. So the rationale for prohibition or law reform rests on two pillars. One is, my clicking isn't working very well here, the findings on corporal punishment's outcomes, and the second is human rights standards. And I'm going to address both, starting with the research. So first, I'm going to provide a quick summary of what we've learned from studies that have been conducted over the last several decades. And then I'm going to highlight some findings from very recent studies. Hundreds of studies have been conducted, and they have used a wide range of sophisticated and robust research designs, and they've been carried out in a range of countries. So I want to say that right off the bat, because you'll hear criticisms, they're all correlational. That is not true at all, or they're all from the US, and that is not true either. Consistently, this research has found corporal punishment to be associated with numerous negative outcomes. Much of what I'm going to show you comes from what we've learned from two major meta-analyses. The first was published in 2002, and the second in 2016. The main difference between the two is that the second one focused solely on studies of normative corporal punishment, or what we in North America would call spanking, and what I think you in Australia would call smacking. So that's the difference between the two, but lo and behold, they found the same thing. And that is this. If we were to sum up the research on one slide, this is what it shows. That corporal punishment predicts a range of solely negative outcomes, including mental health problems such as depression and anxiety, social problems such as aggression and bullying, dating violence, and later violence in the family when these children grow up. It predicts behavior problems and worsening behavior over time. It also predicts weaker moral internalization. This speaks to Nitin's statement, his daughter's very insightful conclusion that corporal punishment does not increase children's understanding of right and wrong. In fact, it seems to do the opposite. It makes children more centered on themselves and less concerned about the reasons why we don't hurt other people. It's also a predictor of slower language development and slower intellectual development. And it also predicts, not surprisingly, poorer relationships with parents. And this ties in with what Kelly said. about children who are hurt wanting to avoid the thing that's hurting them. And in this case, we're talking usually about parents. And so they start to distance themselves from their parents, and it erodes the trust, the attachment, and the whole relationship. So what this shows is that there's a wide range of negative outcomes, and these are highly consistent, highly robust across countries, across cultures. And I'm now just going to show you one sampling of a study that looked at 49 countries. And this researcher found that children who experienced, my phone is ringing, I'm sorry, I should have turned it off. Children who experienced corporal punishment were 24 to 38% less likely to have reached basic developmental milestones, and 30% less likely to be on track in the social emotional domain. Now, the consistency of these findings has led an increasing number of researchers recently to call for corporal punishment to be classified as an adverse childhood experience, or an ACE. And I'll show you the findings of just one study that has contributed to this conclusion. What you see here are for those of you who are researchers, you'll know what I'm talking about with the adjusted odds ratios, which is it's a statistic that it tells you how strongly one thing predicts another. So a predictor predicts an outcome. And these odds ratios are from an analysis of the original ACEs study data. So if you look at the red figures, they're the odds ratios for corporal punishment. And what you see here is that corporal punishment is actually a stronger predictor than physical abuse of drug and alcohol use later in life, and it's a significant predictor of suicide attempts. So we're talking about an issue that has very wide-ranging and cascading effects. These studies, I need to point out, control for a lot of things. I mean, researchers know there are a lot of factors in children's lives that need to be ruled out in order to draw conclusions about one of them. And no matter what variables we control for, no matter the age of the child, the questions used, we find the same thing over and over and over. Another area of research that's getting increasing attention is the impact of corporal punishment on the developing brain. Some time ago, Tomoda et al. Found that the volume of the prefrontal cortex, which is the seat of executive function, which is where our planning and decision-making and judgment and inhibition are located, is reduced by 15 to 19% in those who have been hit with objects. So we start to think about what are the mechanisms that underlie corporal punishment and increased aggression, for example. Part of it is modeling, no doubt whatsoever, that's been demonstrated. Part of it is brain architecture that's being impinged, that's being interfered with, and those connections that we want to build between the emotional and the thinking parts of the brain are being, they're getting messed up. A more recent fMRI study found that children who are spanked or smacked show atypical brain activity. Specifically, the parts of their brains that respond to threat are hyper-responsive. So this means that if there's a threatening or fearful stimulus that comes before a child, those who have been spanked or smacked are more likely to react to that with a high level of arousal. And so that would make them more likely to go into fight, flight, or freeze. So they may become more aggressive, they may withdraw. But they're hyper vigilant, hyper aroused by fearful stimuli. So far, I've been presenting findings showing corporal punishment's negative impacts, but has it ever been shown to have positive impacts? And I'll just mention here that we've been talking about compliance as one of those impacts. That is actually very unreliable. It doesn't predict compliance in as consistent a way as it predicts negative outcomes. And it can take a lot of hitting to obtain that compliance. So let's look at positive outcomes. My colleagues and I conducted a systematic review of the 69 prospective longitudinal studies conducted since 2002 that examine only that normative corporal punishment, spanking, smacking. This review was published in The Lancet in 2021. And this is important because these prospective longitudinal studies control for the child's behavior at the start of the study, so you can follow changes over time and draw more, you have more justification for drawing conclusions in one causal direction. So I'm going to show you one table that summarizes the findings, and it is this one. There were 98 effect sizes that we examined, and none showed any benefits of corporal punishment. In fact, no study has ever found corporal punishment to be a benefit to children's health or well-being. And there are many that show negative impacts. I often think about what would we do if we found out that if you took 100 milligrams of vitamin C a day, one study shows that that will prevent heart disease. How many of us would run out and buy vitamin C? Now, what if we found hundreds of studies that showed that and none showed that it didn't prevent heart disease? We'd be pretty darn confident, right? There's every reason to be confident in the research. There's virtually no debate anymore in the literature, and the ways that people speak about corporal punishment now in the literature have changed dramatically. It's not a technique. It's not a strategy. It's not discipline. It is violence. It's a harmful act of force against a child that's just as damaging and just as violent as if it was done against an adult. So unfortunately, we have to justify all of this on the basis of research, but really the primary justification is human rights. We seem to think that, we realize that other forms of violence are just violations of a person's bodily integrity. But for children, we have to have mountains of research to show that it actually doesn't do any good. Whereas really the fundamental reason is that they are people. So now I'm going to turn to the human rights pillar. Australia, as you no doubt know, ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1990, a year before Canada, you'll be happy to hear. And Article 19, as has already been shown, states that states parties shall take all appropriate legislative, administrative, social, and educational measures to protect the child from all forms of physical or mental violence. But some governments argue that corporal punishment is not violence. So the Committee on the Rights of the Child released a general comment that there is no ambiguity. All forms of physical or mental violence does not leave room for any level of legalized violence against children. So on the basis of research findings and the human rights imperative, corporal punishment is being redefined around the world as violence against children, and governments are increasingly confronting this loophole in their child protection legislation. And I'm going to talk about the countries with prohibitions because it's just so interesting that 63 countries have legally prohibited all corporal punishment of children, plus Scotland and Wales, which we can't count in that list because they're not sovereign states. The 35 countries in Europe have prohibitions, 11 in Central and South America, 1 in the Middle East, 10 in Africa, and 6 in the Asia Pacific region. And you can see the region that is most conspicuous by its absence, which is North America, where George and I hail from. We have not made headway yet. Though this is a list of the countries with full prohibitions in reverse chronological order. You can see Sweden was the first in 1979. When other countries saw that Sweden didn't fall apart, they began to follow suit, and the pace has increased with every decade. There are three primary.
Just one more minute, Joan. Just one more minute.
Okay. I may have to stop here. There are 3 primary objectives of law reform. First, every country that has ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child has an obligation to prohibit corporal punishment. I mean, we have an obligation to do more than repeal. We actually have an obligation to prohibit, but our countries, yours and mine, aren't ready to hear that yet. Second, having a clear law allows for proactive and preventive intervention before violence escalates. So the message isn't muddied by these gray areas like where you hit them and how old they should be and what kind of mark you can leave and for how long and all that kind of ridiculousness. With a clear message in law, families can be supported earlier rather than waiting until the child has been harmed, when intervention must be more severe. And the third objective is to change the social norm. So where smacking is seen as normative, useful, harmless, and even necessary, children are hit and hurt more. And so just as we've changed the norms around drinking and driving, using seatbelts, smoking in restaurants, and many other public health issues, we can change the norms around hitting children. Now, I do have slides to show you what's happened in 3 countries, but I don't think I have time. And so maybe we can work that in somewhere along the way. Thank you very much.
Lovely, Joan. Thank you very much. I'll just invite people to ask any questions if you have any. We've got a couple of minutes for questions. Daryl, do you want to kick off there?
I want to hog the show, but yeah, I'm just interested, Joan, in, absolutely the research is clear, and yet the anecdote, the personal experience that you often hear put forward by parents saying, but I was hit and it never hurt me. How do you kind of think, from a research perspective, you counter that kind of anecdotal view that's contrary to the research view?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't want to judge anyone's mental health. So, maybe they are okay and they're among the lucky ones, but they're not okay because of the corporal punishment. They're okay despite it. It's like when I was a child, we drove all over North America in the back of my dad's Starliner with no seat belts, and we were flying, oh, it was ridiculous what my sister and I were doing there in the back seat. And I'm fine. But what we realized from research at the population level is that the chances of me not being fine were greatly heightened by that situation. So we started doing a lot of public education and changing laws to protect children, because putting me in the back seat didn't do anything for my health. It only put it at risk. The other thing I think we need to think about is that, how do we define okay? Like, if we look at our relationships with our parents, if we look at maybe our anxiety levels or depression levels or other kinds of aspects of ourselves that aren't that great, maybe, it didn't have to be that way. But also, a lot of things can be caused by things other than corporal punishment as well. We're not saying there's a one-to-one correspondence here and that every negative outcome is caused by corporal punishment, and corporal punishment will always lead to negative outcomes. Neither one of those things is true. It's about risk, right? So I could smoke 3 packs a day and not die of smoking related causes. In fact, chances are I won't. But the risk is so substantially raised that we've taken tremendous action to try to eliminate smoking. So it's a matter of risk, and there's no benefit, 0. So we can only improve outcomes for children if we stop hurting them.
Lovely. Thank you, Joan. I'm afraid we're going to have to bring the questions to an end. I note, Nitin, you have an interesting comment in the chat about parental perspective. We often do think the short-term benefits or short-term gain and not always thinking about the long-term consequences. And I think that really adds to what you've just spoken about.
That's the heart of it. Yeah.
So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and for your amazing contribution you've made to our field, to be able to draw on your work and what you've collected and generated to help us all work on this cause together. So thank you, Joan. It's wonderful.
Thank you so much.